The Machiavellian art of ignoring people.
The power of absence. There is a strange kind of power in silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of weakness, not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has finally understood one brutal truth. Not everyone deserves your reaction. In a world where people are constantly fighting for attention, approval, validation, and emotional control, the person who knows when to say nothing becomes dangerous. Because most people are not used to being ignored. They are used to noise, used to emotional access, used to provoking responses, used to pushing buttons and getting immediate reactions, used to saying something disrespectful and watching you explain yourself, used to withdrawing affection and seeing you panic, used to creating confusion and watching you chase clarity. But the moment you stop participating, the moment you stop explaining, the moment you stop reacting, the entire game changes. And that is where this art begins. The Machiavellian art of ignoring people is not about being rude. It is not about childish silence. It is not about pretending people do not exist just to appear mysterious. No. This is something far more calculated, far more strategic, far more powerful. It is about understanding that attention is currency. And most people are bankrupt because they spend it too freely. Every argument, every emotional outburst, every late-night explanation, every desperate attempt to be understood, every response to disrespect, every effort to prove your worth to someone who has already decided to misunderstand you. All of it costs something. And over time, if you are not careful, you will realize you have spent your peace trying to educate people who never intended to learn you. That is the tragedy of emotional overexposure. You begin to think that if you just explain better, if you just clarify one more time, if you just show your heart one more time, then maybe they will finally understand you. But some people do not misunderstand you by accident. They misunderstand you on purpose. Because confusion is control. And the moment you understand that, you begin to see why silence is not always passive. Sometimes, silence is warfare. Because when you remove your energy, your attention, your emotional labor, and your accessibility from the wrong people, you are not losing power. You are taking it back. You see, the average person has been conditioned to believe that every emotional disturbance deserves a response. Someone posts something shady online? Respond. Someone throws a subtle insult? Respond. Someone starts acting cold? Respond. Someone changes their behavior? Respond. Someone disrespects your presence? Respond. And because of this conditioning, many people have unknowingly become puppets in other people's emotional games. They dance every time someone pulls a string. A text goes unanswered? Anxiety. A tone changes? Panic. An invitation is withdrawn? Overthinking. A rumor is heard? Defensiveness. A criticism is made? Immediate self-justification. And little by little, without even realizing it, they hand over the keys to their inner world to anyone with enough audacity to provoke them. That is not strength. That is dependency disguised as emotional honesty. Because true power is not found in how loudly you defend yourself. It is found in how calmly you can withhold yourself. There is something deeply unsettling about a person who refuses to be emotionally recruited into nonsense, a person who hears disrespect and does not flinch, a person who sees manipulation and does not react, a person who notices the bait and still refuses to bite. That kind of person becomes unreadable, and unreadable people are hard to control. That is what makes ignoring so effective. It breaks the script. People are often not disturbed by your anger. They are disturbed by your indifference. Because anger still proves they can reach you.
Sadness still proves they can move you. Defensiveness still proves they matter enough to trigger explanation. But indifference sends a message most people are not emotionally prepared to receive. And that message is, you no longer have access to me. That message wounds the ego more deeply than shouting ever could. Because ego can survive conflict, ego can survive arguments, ego can survive rejection if it still feels important enough to be acknowledged. But what ego cannot easily survive is irrelevance. And when someone realizes they can no longer disturb your peace, occupy your mind, or control your emotional climate, they are forced to confront the one thing they have been avoiding all along, their own powerlessness. Now, let's be honest. Ignoring people is not easy. It sounds simple in theory, but in practice it can feel like torture. Because human beings are emotional creatures. We crave resolution. We crave understanding. We crave emotional completion. When someone hurts us, disrespects us, excludes us, lies on us, or suddenly changes toward us, there is a natural urge to do something, to fix it, to challenge it, to expose it, to defend ourselves against it. And this is where many people lose, not because they are weak, but because they have never trained themselves to tolerate the discomfort of non-reaction. That is what most people do not understand. Ignoring is not passive. Ignoring is a discipline. It is the ability to sit in emotional tension without surrendering your self-control. It is the refusal to let temporary discomfort force permanent regret. It is choosing strategy over impulse. And that is rare. Very rare, because most people are ruled by immediacy. They want to say what they feel right now, do what they feel right now, react how they feel right now. But people who live like that are easy to manipulate, because if I can predict your reaction, I can control your behavior. If I know exactly what will make you speak, what will make you chase, what will make you defend, what will make you lose your calm, then I don't need to overpower you. I only need to provoke you. And that is how many emotional games are won, not through strength, but through predictability. The manipulator studies your hunger. The toxic friend studies your insecurity. The narcissist studies your need for closure. The attention seeker studies your sensitivity. The disrespectful person studies how badly you want to be seen as the bigger person. And once they understand what pulls you, they pull it. Again and again. Until you become exhausted, until you become reactive, until you become emotionally available to chaos. That is why strategic ignoring is not just a social skill. It is psychological self-defense. It is how you protect your peace in a world full of people who benefit from your instability. And perhaps the hardest part of this lesson is realizing this. Sometimes, people are not looking for connection. They are looking for access. Access to your emotions, access to your energy, access to your softness, access to your patience, access to your attention. And once they gain access, they do not always honor it. Some people enter your life not to love you, but to consume you. To study your reactions, to test your limits, to see how much they can take before you finally disappear. And if you are not careful, you will spend years trying to be understood by people who are only ever interested in seeing how far they could push you. That is why silence becomes sacred, because silence is often the first sign that you are no longer willing to be emotionally available to abuse disguised as misunderstanding. You stop arguing, you stop over-explaining, you stop volunteering your heart where there is no safety, you stop auditioning for respect, and in that silence, you begin to return to yourself. There is a reason some of the most powerful people in history understood the value of restraint. They knew that visibility without control is vulnerability. They knew that emotional exposure without strategy is weakness. They knew that the person who reveals everything, who reacts to everything, who responds to everything, can be studied, anticipated, and defeated. But the person who remains composed, who withholds access, who chooses when and where to engage, that person becomes difficult to read, difficult to provoke, difficult to conquer. That is why silence unsettles people, because silence removes the map. When you stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you, they lose the blueprint they once used to navigate your mind. And when people lose access to your inner workings, they often become frustrated. Why? Because they can no longer predict your next move. They can no longer use your feelings against you. They can no longer rely on your desperation for harmony to keep controlling the situation. And this is where many people make a mistake. They assume that if someone gets angry when ignored, it means the silence is cruel. Not always. Sometimes their anger is not about being hurt. Sometimes their anger is about losing control. There is a difference, a very important difference, because healthy people communicate, healthy people ask questions, healthy people seek clarity, healthy people respect emotional boundaries. But controlling people often panic when they are no longer the center of your emotional world. And when they panic, they do what they always do. They escalate. They may become louder, colder, more dramatic, more provocative, more insulting, more manipulative. Why? Because when subtle control stops working, they often increase intensity. This is one of the most important things you must understand if you are ever going to master this art. Silence often reveals people more clearly than conversation ever will. When you stop chasing, you discover who enjoyed being chased. When you stop explaining, you discover who was committed to misunderstanding. When you stop reaching out, you discover who was comfortable let relationships survive only on your effort. When you stop reacting, you discover who is feeding off your emotional energy. And those revelations can be painful, very painful, because many people are not actually mourning the loss of a person. They are mourning the loss of an illusion. The illusion that this person cared. The illusion that this relationship was mutual. The illusion that respect existed. The illusion that your patience would eventually be appreciated. But sometimes the truth only arrives when you finally become still. And stillness can be terrifying if you have built your emotional life around noise. That is why many people would rather keep arguing than face the silence that reveals reality. Because conflict at least feels like connection. Even if it's toxic, even if it's draining, even if it's humiliating, at least it feels like something. And many people are so starved for emotional significance that they will accept conflict over emptiness. But growth requires something different. Growth requires the courage to stop feeding what is feeding on you. Read that again in your spirit. Growth requires the courage to stop feeding.
Why ignoring people hurts them more than revenge. There is something almost cruel about being ignored. Not because silence is always cruel, but because for many people, silence forces them into a confrontation they have spent their whole lives avoiding, a confrontation with themselves. That is what makes ignoring so psychologically devastating. Most people assume that pain comes from attack, from criticism, from conflict, from rejection, from betrayal. And yes, all of those things can hurt. But there is another kind of pain, a quieter one, a deeper one, a pain so subtle that people often do not even realize why it affects them so much. It is the pain of not being acknowledged. Because for the human ego, acknowledgement is oxygen. To be seen, to be felt, to be noticed, to be reacted to be emotionally registered in another person's mind. That is what gives many people their sense of significance. So when someone loses that access, when their presence no longer creates emotional movement in you, something inside them begins to panic. And that panic can become more intense than anger. Why? Because anger still gives people a role in your emotional world. If you scream at someone, they still matter. If you argue with them, they still occupy your mind. If you defend yourself to them, they still hold influence. If you seek revenge, they still own space in your spirit. But when you ignore someone strategically, you communicate something far more devastating than hatred. You communicate, "You no longer have the power to move me." And that message can be unbearable to the wrong person. Especially to people who built their identity around being emotionally impactful. Some people do not care whether they are loved or feared. They only care that they are felt. That they can disturb your peace, that they can shift your mood, that they can make you question yourself, that they can interrupt your emotional stability. And when that ability disappears, their sense of control begins to collapse. That is why some people become obsessed with those who ignore them. Not because they suddenly care deeply, not because they have become emotionally sincere overnight, not because they have had a spiritual awakening. No, many times what they are really experiencing is ego injury. And ego injury is powerful. Because when a person's ego is wounded, they often do not seek healing, they seek re-entry. They want to get back inside your emotional system. They want to trigger something, anything, a reply, an explanation, a complaint, a defensive message, a passive-aggressive post, a visible sadness, a sign that they still exist inside your mind. Because if they can still make you react, they can still reassure themselves that they matter. And this is why silence can hurt people more than revenge. Revenge is obvious. Revenge is emotional. Revenge says, "You hurt me, and now I want to hurt you back." But silence? Silence says something colder. Silence says, "You are not worth the emotional investment." That is a level of detachment many people are not built to tolerate. Because human beings are wired to search for emotional feedback. We want closure. We want answers. We want emotional confirmation. We want to know where we stand. We want to know what effect we had. And when none of that is given,
the mind begins to fill in the blanks. That is where silence becomes dangerous. Because silence creates a vacuum, and the human mind hates vacuums. When people do not know what you are thinking, they start imagining. When they do not know how you feel, they start projecting. When they do not know whether they still matter, they start spiraling. And in that spiral, they often suffer more than any direct punishment could have caused. Because punishment gives form to pain, but uncertainty multiplies it. Think about it. When someone knows you hate them, at least they have certainty. When someone knows you're angry, at least they understand the emotional landscape. When someone knows you're plotting revenge, at least they know the war is still active. But when someone cannot tell whether you care at all, whether they have been forgotten, whether they ever truly mattered to you in the first place, that ambiguity becomes a prison, and many people will do almost anything to escape that prison. They may suddenly reach out, they may become nice, they may try to provoke you, they may use mutual friends, they may post things hoping you will see them, they may subtly mention your name, they may pretend to move on loudly just to see if you notice. Why? Because they are not necessarily trying to reconnect. Sometimes, they are trying to regain psychological confirmation. They want proof that they still have a place in your nervous system. That's the thing people rarely talk about. A lot of communication is not actually communication, it is emotional surveillance. People checking whether they still have access, people checking whether they still have influence, people trying to measure whether they still matter enough to provoke movement. And if you don't understand this, you will keep mistaking manipulative reappearances for genuine connection. You will think, they miss me, they care, they have changed, they are finally realizing my value. But not every return is repentance. Sometimes, it is just curiosity mixed with ego. Sometimes, they are not coming back because they love you, they are coming back because your silence became louder than their pride. And that is why strategic ignoring must be done with awareness, because once silence starts working, many people do not become better, they become more creative. They begin to test the perimeter. They send a just checking on you message. They suddenly act nostalgic. They may apologize halfway. They may create situations where your name comes up. They may attempt to appear transformed. They may attempt emotional bait disguised as sincerity. And if you're not careful, you will break your own boundary because you mistake their discomfort for growth. But discomfort is not transformation. Missing access is not the same as developing respect. And just because someone is affected by your absence does not mean they are worthy of your return. That distinction can save your life, because some people do not miss you. They miss the version of you they could still influence. They miss your softness, your patience, your availability, your willingness to explain, your tendency to forgive too quickly, your habit of making room for behavior that should have disqualified them. And when that version of you disappears, they begin to feel loss. But let us be honest, they are not always mourning you. Sometimes they are mourning the death of their convenience. And that is why silence is so clarifying. It forces both people to face the truth. You begin to see who reaches out with humility, and who only returns when their control is threatened. You begin to see who truly values your presence, and who only valued your emotional responsiveness. You begin to see who is capable of reflection, and who is only capable of reaction. This is why some of the strongest forms of power are invisible. Not everything powerful looks aggressive. Not everything effective looks dramatic. Not everything transformative comes with a loud declaration. Sometimes the most powerful move is to simply withdraw access. No scene, no speech, no dramatic exit, no emotional monologue, just absence. And for the wrong person, absence is devastating. Because absence does what confrontation often fails to do. It removes your cooperation. That is a sentence many people need to hear. Silence removes your cooperation. And every dysfunctional dynamic requires cooperation to survive. Every toxic argument requires two emotional participants. Every manipulation requires someone willing to engage. Every control game requires someone who still feels compelled to respond. The moment you stop cooperating, the machine begins to break. And that is why silence often creates chaos in people who depended on your participation. Because your reaction was part of their system. Your emotional labor was part of their comfort. Your explanations were part of their control. Your availability was part of their advantage. And when you remove those things, they don't just lose a person, they lose a mechanism, a system they have become accustomed to using. That is why they may suddenly act confused. Why are you acting different? Why are you so distant? What happened to you? Why are you ignoring me? But what they often mean is, why can't I reach you the way I used to? And that question alone reveals everything. Because healthy people do not become offended by your boundaries. They may feel hurt, they may feel concerned, they may seek clarity, but they do not become enraged by your emotional autonomy. Only those who benefited from your lack of boundaries tend to feel deeply threatened when boundaries finally appear. And perhaps that is one of the most painful truths of maturity. Sometimes the people most upset by your silence are the very people who gave you the strongest reason to become silent in the first place. That is not irony. That is exposure. And exposure makes people dangerous. Because once someone realizes they can no longer control you through ordinary methods, they may escalate into extraordinary ones. Smear campaigns, subtle disrespect, playing victim, selective storytelling, guilt trips, performative concern, sudden generosity, emotional confusion, attempts to make you feel cruel for protecting your peace. This is why ignoring people is not just about saying nothing. It is about understanding what your silence will activate in others. Because silence is not empty. Silence is pressure. It presses on insecurity. It presses on ego. It presses on entitlement. It presses on dependency. It presses on hidden motives. And when pressure is applied, character is revealed. That is why some people cannot handle being ignored. It is not just because they miss you. It is because silence removes the distractions they once used to avoid themselves. No more emotional smoke. No more argument to hide behind. No more conflict to distract from their own emptiness. No more access to use as a sedative. And in that stillness, they are left with their own mind, their own conscience, their own insecurity, their own uncertainty, their own irrelevance. And that is where the real pain begins, because when someone can no longer externalize their chaos onto you, they are forced to carry it alone. That is unbearable for many, which is why so many people prefer drama over silence. Drama is easier than reflection. Drama gives them something to do, someone to blame, something to point at, something to perform, something to distract themselves with. But silence strips all that away. And if they have never learned how to sit with themselves, your silence can become a mirror they desperately want to shatter. That is why some people will insult you when they cannot access you, mock you when they cannot reach you, discredit you when they cannot control you, minimize you when they cannot manipulate you, because if they cannot get your energy, they will often try to attack your image. That is a common pattern. People often slander what they can no longer dominate. So if you ever find that your silence causes people to become strangely dramatic, hostile, or obsessed, do not always mistake that for proof that they care. Sometimes it is proof that your absence exposed something they can no longer comfortably hide. And that exposure burns. It burns because it reminds them that they are no longer central, no longer significant, no longer in control, no longer entitled to your inner world. That is a difficult reality for an undisciplined ego to accept. And if you understand this deeply, you will stop feeling guilty every time your silence unsettles the wrong people, because not all discomfort is injustice. Sometimes discomfort is simply the cost of no longer having access to someone you took for granted. That is not cruelty, that is consequence. And consequence often sounds like silence. There is a reason wise people do not always seek revenge, because revenge keeps you spiritually entangled. It ties your healing to another person's suffering. It keeps your mind in the same battlefield. It keeps your energy circling the same wound. But silence allows you to exit the battlefield entirely, and there is no greater victory than becoming inaccessible to what once had power over you. Read that carefully. There is no greater victory than becoming inaccessible to what once had power over you. That is the kind of power that does not need applause, the kind of strength that does not need witnesses, the kind of healing that does not announce itself. It simply becomes evident in your refusal to return to emotional slavery. And maybe that is why silence is feared, because it is the language of someone who has finally learned their worth, someone who no longer needs to beg for respect, no longer needs to force understanding, no longer needs to over-explain their pain, no longer needs to keep proving what should have already been obvious. And when you reach that level, your silence changes. It is no longer bitter. It is no longer reactive. It is no longer a tactic of emotional immaturity. It becomes something much more refined. It becomes discernment. And discernment is cold to those who benefited from your confusion, because confusion made you easier to access, easier to manipulate, easier to keep in circles, easier to emotionally drain. But clarity creates distance. And distance terrifies those who once mistook your presence for permanent permission. So yes, ignoring people can hurt them more than revenge. Not because you were trying to punish them, but because silence forces them to sit in the very emptiness they once tried to fill with your energy. And if they never learned how to survive without access,
when ignoring becomes a weapon, the difference between power and emotional avoidance. Not all silence is strength. Some silence is wisdom. Some silence is discipline. Some silence is self-respect. Some silence is protection. But some silence is just fear wearing a mask of power. And if you do not know the difference, you will start calling your wounds strategy, while they quietly poison your life from the inside. That is the danger. Because once people discover the psychological effect of ignoring others, many become intoxicated by it. They begin to enjoy the mystery, the control, the emotional confusion it creates, the power shift, the ego boost that comes from watching people panic when access is removed. And that is where silence can become corrupt. Because the same tool that protects you can also transform you into the very kind of person you once needed protection from. That is why this lesson matters. If you are going to master the art of ignoring people, you must first understand this brutal truth. Silence is not automatically noble. Sometimes silence is maturity, and sometimes silence is manipulation. Sometimes silence says, I value my peace, and sometimes silence says, I want you to suffer. Sometimes silence says, I refuse to participate in dysfunction, and sometimes silence says, I do not know how to communicate, so I will disappear and call it power. Those are not the same thing, not even close, and the world often confuses them. You have probably seen it before. Someone gets hurt, but instead of processing it, they shut down completely. Someone is confronted with truth, but instead of responding honestly, they retreat into distance. Someone fears vulnerability, so they become hard to reach. Someone lacks emotional maturity, so they call avoidance boundaries. Someone refuses accountability, so they disappear and claim they are protecting their energy. But in reality, they are not protecting peace. They are protecting ego. And ego-driven silence is dangerous because it feels powerful while secretly keeping you emotionally underdeveloped. That is the part many people do not want to hear. You can ignore people and still be deeply unhealed. You can be distant and still be fragile. You can be unavailable and still be emotionally dependent. You can look calm on the outside while being internally controlled by the very thing you refuse to address.
That is not mastery. That is emotional paralysis, and paralysis is not peace. Let that sink in. Paralysis is not peace. Just because you are quiet does not mean you are healed. Just because you are absent does not mean you are detached. Just because you are no longer speaking to someone does not mean they no longer have power over your mind. Some people are silent while still replaying the entire war in their head every night, still imagining arguments, still waiting for messages, still checking social media, still hoping to be missed, still fantasizing about being chased, still secretly craving validation from the very people they pretend to have outgrown. That is not silence. That is obsession in disguise. And one of the hardest truths of emotional growth is this: you can physically leave a dynamic while remaining psychologically trapped inside it. That is why strategic silence must come from clarity, not resentment. Because if your silence is fueled entirely by bitterness, pride, or revenge, then your silence is not setting you free. It's just giving your pain a quieter room to live in. And quiet pain can become dangerous. Because pain that is not processed does not disappear. It mutates. It becomes coldness, suspicion, emotional numbness, chronic detachment, intimacy issues, punishment disguised as standards, distance disguised as dignity. And before long, you are not just protecting yourself from toxic people, you are protecting yourself from everyone. Even the healthy ones, even the sincere ones, even the safe ones, even the people who came with good intentions. Because once pain hardens into identity, you stop discerning between danger and love. Everything begins to feel like a threat. And when that happens, silence is no longer serving you. It is imprisoning you. This is where many people lose themselves. They get hurt once, twice, maybe many times. And eventually they conclude, from now on, I will give nobody access. I will never explain myself again. I will never be emotionally available again. I will disappear before anyone can hurt me. And at first, that mindset feels empowering. It feels clean. It feels safe. It feels controlled. But over time, it becomes lonely. Very lonely. Because human beings were not designed only for defense, we were also designed for connection. For truth, for trust, for mutuality, for vulnerability with the right people. So if your silence makes you untouchable to everyone, then you have not mastered emotional power. You have just built a more elegant prison. And elegant prisons are the hardest to escape because they often look like self-respect from the outside. That is why you must ask yourself a difficult question whenever you withdraw from someone. Am I becoming silent because I am strong or because I am scared? That question can expose everything, because strength and fear can sometimes produce the same behavior externally. Both can look like distance, both can look like restraint, both can look like quiet, both can look like moving on, but internally they are completely different worlds. Strength says, I have assessed this situation and chosen peace. Fear says, I cannot tolerate emotional uncertainty, so I am shutting everything down. Strength says, this no longer deserves my energy. Fear says, if I engage, I may feel something I do not know how to handle. Strength says, I know who I am and I do not need to chase understanding. Fear says, I am terrified of rejection, so I will leave before I can be left. Do you see the difference? One is power. The other is self-protection rooted in unhealed pain. And if you are honest, many people use silence not because they are in control, but because they do not know how to remain emotionally present without feeling vulnerability. So they vanish, withdraw, delay, ignore, ghost, detach. Not from strength, but from discomfort. That is not Machiavellian strategy. That is emotional illiteracy. And emotional illiteracy destroys relationships more quietly than conflict ever could. Because conflict at least shows engagement, at least shows there is something still alive enough to address. But emotional avoidance? Emotional avoidance slowly rots everything from within. It creates confusion where honesty was needed, distance where clarity was needed, silence where courage was needed. And over time, it turns potentially repairable situations into emotional graveyards. This is why the wise do not use silence carelessly. They understand that silence is a scalpel, not a hammer. It must be used with precision. Because not every conflict deserves abandonment, not every misunderstanding deserves distance, not every emotional discomfort is a sign that you should disappear. Some things require conversation, some things require boundaries spoken out loud, some things require mature closure, some things require difficult honesty. And if you keep using silence as your first and only response, you will eventually sabotage things that might have actually been healthy. That is why discernment matters more than performance. A lot of people are performing detachment online these days. They speak as though being emotionally unreachable is the highest form of evolution, as though caring less automatically makes you wiser, as though disappearing makes you powerful, as though withholding communication is always a sign of superiority. But truthfully, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to ignore someone. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to speak clearly, once, with dignity, and then leave. That is real power. Because it takes much more strength to be emotionally honest than to hide behind ambiguity. It takes more courage to say, this behavior is unacceptable. This dynamic is unhealthy. I no longer wish to continue this. I have outgrown this connection. This no longer aligns with my peace. That kind of communication is not weakness. It is refinement. It is emotional adulthood. And once you do that, if distance becomes necessary, then your silence has integrity. That is the key word. Integrity. Because silence without integrity becomes punishment. Silence with integrity becomes protection. And the difference matters. A lot. Because punishment-focused silence seeks to control how the other person feels. Protection-focused silence seeks to control what you continue to allow. Punishment says, I want you to feel my absence and suffer. Protection says, I am no longer available for this dynamic. Punishment is still emotionally entangled. Protection is emotionally resolved. That is why some silence leaves you chained, while other silence sets you free. You can tell the difference by one simple test. If they came back right now, would your nervous system still collapse? If yes, then your silence may not be free and yet. It may simply be distance without healing. And distance without healing can create the illusion of progress, while the wound remains untouched. That is why time alone does not heal, distance alone does not heal, ignoring alone does not heal, detachment alone does not heal. Healing only begins when truth enters the room. Truth about what happened, truth about what hurt, truth about what you tolerated, truth about why you stayed, truth about what part of you kept hoping, truth about what part of you still aches. Without that truth, silence becomes cosmetic. It changes the appearance of the wound, but not the wound itself. And cosmetic healing is dangerous because it makes you look strong while keeping you spiritually fragile. That is why some people become colder after heartbreak instead of wiser. They do not heal, they adapt through numbness. And numbness can feel like power because it reduces pain, but numbness also reduces intimacy, compassion, softness, joy, trust, openness, depth. So if your silence is costing you your humanity, it is too expensive. If your silence is costing you your humanity, it is too expensive. Real power does not require you to become emotionally dead. Real power does not require you to become unreachable to everyone. Real power does not require you to punish every person for the sins of the last one. Real power does not require you to turn your heart into stone just because someone mishandled it. No. Real power is much more sophisticated than that. Real power is knowing how to stay soft without staying stupid, how to remain open without remaining exposed, how to maintain dignity without becoming cold, how to walk away without becoming bitter. That is mastery. That is the difference between someone who is truly evolving and someone who is simply becoming harder to love. And perhaps the most dangerous people are not always the loud manipulators. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the silent ones who never learned how to feel honestly. Because unresolved silence often becomes silent cruelty. They withhold affection instead of communicating, withhold clarity instead of speaking, withhold presence instead of ending things cleanly, withhold emotional truth while pretending to be unbothered. And the damage that causes is enormous. Because being ignored by someone emotionally immature can make you question your worth, can make you doubt your reality, can make you obsess over what...
How to become emotionally untouchable without becoming cold. There is a version of strength that many people admire, but should never imitate. It is the kind of strength that looks invincible on the outside, but is emotionally dead on the inside. The kind of person who feels nothing, trusts no one, lets no one in, needs no one, explains nothing, shares nothing, softens for no one. At first glance, that kind of person looks powerful. They look impossible to hurt, impossible to read, impossible to control. And in many ways they are, but they are also often impossible to love. Because somewhere along the way, in their effort to become untouchable, they accidentally became unreachable. And those are not the same thing. That is one of the greatest emotional deceptions of modern life. Many people think they are healing, when in reality, they are just becoming colder. Colder in speech, colder in trust, colder in openness, colder in affection, colder in vulnerability, colder in hope. And because coldness often resembles control, they mistake it for growth. But control is not always healing. Sometimes control is just trauma trying to prevent itself from ever being surprised again. That is why true emotional mastery is much more nuanced than simple detachment. The goal is not to become numb. The goal is not to stop caring. The goal is not to become inaccessible to everyone. The goal is not to kill your emotions just because they once made you vulnerable.
No, the real goal is much more difficult than that. The real goal is to become so deeply rooted in yourself that other people can no longer destabilize you without your permission. Read that slowly. The goal is to become so deeply rooted in yourself that other people can no longer destabilize you without your permission. That is what it means to be emotionally untouchable. Not that pain never visits you, not that betrayal never stings, not that rejection never disappoints, not that disrespect never offends, but that none of it can permanently remove you from yourself. That is the difference. Because emotional immaturity says, if they change, I collapse. Emotional mastery says, they may change, but I remain. And that kind of inner steadiness is rare, very rare. Because most people build their emotional lives on unstable foundations. They build identity on validation, peace on external consistency, worth on being chosen, confidence on being understood, security on being wanted. So when any of those things shift, they fall apart. Not because they are weak, but because they were taught to outsource their emotional center to other people. And when your center lives in other people's hands, you will spend your life being shaken by every movement they make. A delayed response becomes emotional chaos, a changed tone becomes panic, a withdrawn effort becomes self-doubt, a lack of reassurance becomes insecurity, a misunderstanding becomes identity crisis. Why? Because your peace was never anchored internally. It was rented externally, and anything rented externally can be taken away. That is why becoming emotionally untouchable begins with one sacred decision. You must stop allowing other people's inconsistency to define your inner climate. That one decision changes everything. Because once you make it, you stop living as a psychological hostage. You stop giving every text, every mood, every delay, every shift in behavior the power to disturb your nervous system. You begin to observe more than you absorb. That is one of the most important habits of emotionally powerful people. They observe more than they absorb. They notice tone shifts, but they do not internalize them immediately. They recognize disrespect, but they do not build identity around it. They see manipulation, but they do not become consumed by proving themselves innocent. They detect withdrawal, but they do not instantly assume unworthiness. That is emotional intelligence at its highest form, because not everything people do is a reflection of your value. Sometimes it is a reflection of their wounds, their confusion, their immaturity, their ego, their projections, their limitations. And if you take every behavior personally, you will spend your life carrying emotional burdens that were never yours to begin with. That is why self-possession matters, because when you are self-possessed, you stop being easy to invade. Not physically, not socially, but psychologically. And psychological invasions are some of the most exhausting forms of suffering. Someone says something careless, and it lives in your head for weeks. Someone changes their energy, and now your whole mood is ruined. Someone fails to appreciate you, and now you're questioning your worth. That is invasion. That is what happens when your emotional boundaries are weak. And if you are ever going to become untouchable, you must strengthen the invisible border between what happens around you and what gets to live within you. That border is everything, because life will always bring boys. Disrespect will happen, misunderstanding will happen, disappointment will happen, projection will happen, abandonment may happen, loss may happen. You cannot control all of that, but you can control what you allow to take root inside of identity, and that is where emotional sovereignty begins. Emotional sovereignty. A beautiful concept, a necessary concept, a rare concept. It means your inner world belongs to you, not to your critics, not to your ex, not to the person who ghosted you, not to the family member who never truly saw you, not to the friend who betrayed you, not to the manipulator who studied your weaknesses, not to the crowd that misunderstood your silence. Your inner world belongs to you. And if you truly understand that, you begin to move differently. You stop begging to be interpreted correctly by people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop performing your pain for those who only consume it. You stop explaining your worth to people who only notice value when access is removed. You stop chasing closure from people who benefit from your confusion. You stop asking emotionally unavailable people to handle your heart with the care they have never shown themselves. You stop trying to build emotional homes inside unstable people. That is growth. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, not the kind that announces itself with dramatic speeches and social media captions, but the quiet kind. The kind where your standards become internal, your reactions become deliberate, your energy becomes expensive, your peace becomes protected, your presence becomes intentional. And over time, people begin to notice something has changed about you. They may not be able to explain it, but they feel it. They feel that you are no longer as easy to shake, no longer as easy to guilt, no longer as easy to manipulate, no longer as easy to access, no longer as emotionally available to nonsense. And that is when your silence changes meaning. In the beginning, silence may have been survival, but now, silence becomes selection. That is a different level, a powerful level,
Because when you are emotionally mature, you do not go silent because you are wounded every time. Sometimes you go silent simply because you have learned what deserves your language and what does not. And that is wisdom. Not every battle deserves your sword. Not every insult deserves your defense. Not every misunderstanding deserves your explanation. Not every invitation deserves your presence. Not every person deserves your softness. That is not arrogance. That is stewardship. Stewardship of your attention. Stewardship of your emotional energy. Stewardship of your peace. Stewardship of your mind. And people who do not understand stewardship often call it pride. They say, "You've changed. You think you're better. You're too distant now. You don't care anymore. You've become difficult." But sometimes becoming difficult is exactly what saves you. Because being too accessible is what nearly destroyed you. Being too forgiving, too available, too emotionally transparent, too patient with repeated disrespect, too willing to explain yourself to people who enjoyed misunderstanding you. That version of you may have been kind, but it was not always wise. And kindness without wisdom often becomes self-abandonment. That is another truth many people need to hear. Kindness without wisdom often becomes self-abandonment. You can be a beautiful soul and still have poor boundaries. You can have a good heart and still overextend yourself. You can be loving and still tolerate what should have disqualified people from your life a long time ago. That is why emotional mastery is not just about becoming nice, it is about becoming clear. Clear about what you allow, clear about what you ignore, clear about what you no longer negotiate, clear about who gets access to your softness, clear about where your energy will and will not go. And clarity changes your life. Because confused people are easy to control, but clear people are dangerous. Not dangerous in cruelty, not dangerous in ego, not dangerous in manipulation. Dangerous in the sense that they can no longer easily emotionally recruited into chaos. And that is rare power. The kind of power that does not scream, the kind of power that does not need to dominate, the kind of power that does not need to humiliate others to feel secure. It simply remains unmoved by what no longer aligns. That is elegance. That is command. That is inner authority. And maybe that is the real heart of this entire lesson. The Machiavellian art of ignoring people is not truly about punishing others. It is about mastering access. Who gets your mind? Who gets your attention? Who gets your explanations? Who gets your emotions? Who gets your softness? Who gets your silence? Who gets your absence? Because the quality of your life will often be determined by the quality of people who have emotional access to you. If the wrong people have access, your peace becomes expensive, your mind becomes noisy, your nervous system becomes unstable, your spirit becomes heavy. But when access is governed by discernment, your life changes. You become lighter, calmer, clearer, more grounded, more selective, more sovereign. And with time, you stop asking one desperate question that keeps so many people trapped. How do I make them understand? Instead, you begin asking a much wiser one. Why am I still giving access to someone committed to misunderstanding you? That question can set you free. Because freedom does not always come from being understood. Sometimes freedom comes from finally accepting that understanding is not required for your departure. Understanding is not required for your departure. They do not have to agree. They do not have to validate your experience. They do not have to confess their motives. They do not have to apologize properly. They do not have to suddenly become emotionally mature for you to finally choose peace. You are allowed to leave what keeps disturbing your soul. You are allowed to become unavailable to chaos. You are allowed to stop participating in your own emotional depletion. You are allowed to protect your life from people who only value your presence when they are losing access to it. That is not bitterness. That is awakening. And once you awaken, once you truly awaken, you begin to understand one of the most liberating truths a person can ever learn. Not every door needs to be slammed. Some doors become powerful the moment you simply stop walking through them. And maybe, just maybe, that is the highest form of silence. Not the silence of pain, not the silence of punishment, not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone who has finally outgrown the need to respond to everything that once had power over them. That is peace. That is self-respect. That is psychological maturity. That is emotional command. That is power. And in a world full of noise, that kind of power is almost sacred. So if there is one thing to remember from all of this, let it be this. Your greatest strength will never be in how loudly you can react. It will be in how wisely you can withhold yourself. Protect your peace, protect your attention, protect your energy, protect your mind, protect your access. Because not everyone deserves your presence. And some of the greatest transformations of your life will begin the moment you finally say in silence, "You no longer get this version of me."
If this message spoke to you, then you already know. Some lessons do not come to make you bitter. They come to make you wiser. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to Truth 001 for more deep psychological, philosophical, and life-changing content. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, protect your peace and master your mind.